The North Atlantic fog had not fully loosened its grip overnight. It hung in layers over the water and sifted the first daylight into a dull gray-white, as if the world had been left out in ash. Submarine U-6012 rode the swells like a stranded steel animal, low in the water, too visible, too still. The diesels breathed with a heavy, uneven thrum, mechanical lungs forcing air through a wounded body, and that sound was the only thing on the surface that did not belong to wind, water, or war. The failure had come after their last emergency dive before dawn, a crash submergence meant to slip under approaching screws and survive one more pass. The main battery bank, already strained, had given way under the demand. In both primary battery compartments, the odor of overheated insulation turned acrid, and a faint trace of chlorine edged into the air. Thin enough to miss if you were not trained to fear it, sharp enough to raise the hairs on the back of the throat if you were. Chief Engineer Karl Schmidt had ordered the electrical load cut and initiated an emergency surface, knowing that the alternative was a slow death in poisoned air. Now Karl stood in the control space beneath the bridge, half under the conning tower, with the pressure of the hull around him and the damp cold clinging to everything. The sonar man spoke in a voice that tried to stay professional and failed. Bearings, range estimates, the rhythm of screws, unmistakable closing. Somewhere beyond the steel, destroyer engines were growing louder, and each minute on the surface turned U-6012 from predator into target. A searchlight cut the fog like a blade and nailed the conning tower in place, making the submarine feel suddenly naked. The captain's surrender order came out of a dry throat as if it had to be scraped loose. Once the word was spoken, it moved through the compartments like a dark current. Men who had lived for weeks by routine and discipline were suddenly without the one thing the boat promised, the ability to vanish. Despair did not arrive as crying or collapse. It arrived as silence, as stiff hands on railings, as eyes that did not know where to look. Karl did not feel grief. What rose in him was a sharp, technical humiliation. The boat was his domain. The systems were his responsibility. Every valve, every gauge, every cable run through bulkheads and trays. He knew them the way a man knows his own joints, and now, at the worst possible moment, the system had failed, not under heroic assault, but under the ordinary cruelty of stress and salt and wear. The shame had teeth, but even that shame was pushed aside by urgency. Practicality was the only emotion he trusted. In the cramped familiarity of pipes and fittings, his mind latched onto one concrete problem, the vegetable box. It sat in the corner of the auxiliary battery space next door, where spare capacity and improvised necessity had made room for something that did not belong in a weapon. It was a crude hydroponic rig built from scavenged boards, insulated tubing, and a converted low-voltage bulb. A small pump, wired by hand, pushed nutrient solution through a makeshift loop. Burlap and cloth held a thin medium. In the dim light, a third planting struggled, pale bean sprouts and radish seedlings that had gone limp at the edges, but still refused to die. To Karl, it had never been a hobby. It was a technical answer to a biological problem. Weeks submerged meant men slowly losing what fresh food was supposed to provide. He had seen the early signs before. Skin that bruised too easily, gums that swelled, fatigue that turned discipline into irritation and then into errors. The box was an argument against that decay. In a steel tube, with the air recycled and the water rationed, He had managed to coax something green out of scraps, and the crew had started to look at the weak sprouts as if they were a promise. But surrender changed the meaning of everything. In this instant, the box was no longer his private experiment. It was stores. Fresh vegetables, no matter how thin and half-wilted, were valuable to any force at sea. Karl could not bear the idea of leaving even that small advantage to the enemy, not because it would decide the war, but because it was his to deny. There was no time to weigh morality. The surrender procedure was already beginning. American boarding would follow quickly. Karl called for the 2 engine room men he trusted most. He did not waste words. They understood him the way men do after months in steel confinement. They unbolted the box from its frame. They drained what remained of the nutrient solution into a bucket, then into a line leading to disposal, careful not to splash anything on energized circuits even though power had been cut. The box smelled of damp wood and faint green life. Carrying it through the narrow passageways meant turning shoulders sideways, stepping over calmings, pushing through watertight doors that seemed now more like barriers closing behind them than protection. They reached an emergency ventilation access hatch that was rarely used, pried the cover loose, and felt the raw Atlantic air knifing in. No ceremony, no last look. They shoved the box over the side. It fell into gray water with a small splash, a pale burst that vanished into swell and foam almost before Karl could blink. The sea swallowed it as if the box had never existed. Karl watched until he could no longer pick it out, and a thread inside him loosened. He had destroyed something that in the logic of war counted as supply. It was the last practical act he could still perform as chief engineer in defiance of the enemy. The Americans boarded with speed and method. Men in dark blue cold weather gear came first, submachine guns held ready. They controlled the conning tower and every hatch and choke point with practice movements. Behind them came a second group carrying tool kits and cameras, faces set not like fighters but like technicians arriving at a damaged machine. Major Anderson led them. His gaze moved over U-6012's corroded outer casing, and the German sailors, still wet with fear, still trying to stand straight without visible emotion. He looked as if he were evaluating a complex apparatus, not a defeated crew. Karl and the other officers were ordered to line up on deck. They were searched quickly. Names were checked. Identification was confirmed. The wind cut hard enough to make knees tremble, and the spray and fog worked their way into collars and seams. Anderson took his team down into the submarine. Karl remained on deck under guard, positioned near the hatch where he could hear the interior, boots on ladders, clipped English commands, the metallic snap of camera shutters. Minutes stretched. He listened, tense, waiting for the moment his improvised box would become a question, a point of accusation or demand. Then Anderson's head and shoulders emerged again. He spoke briefly to the officer coordinating the boarding party and pointed out toward the side of the submarine into the band of mist-lit water. Almost immediately, an order came down. A small boat was lowered. Several American sailors climbed in, carrying gaff hooks and rope. Karl's stomach tightened. He followed the motion, and there it was, between swell troughs, between submarine and destroyer, the wooden box bobbing in the water. It had not sunk as he expected. One corner was damaged, but the structure held. Under the searchlight, it looked absurdly clear, a crude box of wet boards and struggling sprouts floating like a message that refused to be lost. The Americans maneuvered with care. They hooked the box as if it could break. They steadied it, tied lines, and lifted it aboard the destroyer, not tossing it like debris, but treating it like equipment worth preserving. Karl felt a jolt of incredulity that turned into unease. Why would they bother? In his mind, it was already garbage, an embarrassing remnant of survival. The sea had been the proper eraser. Yet here they were, refusing even this small thing. A smug, defensive contempt rose in him almost automatically. So the stories were true then. Even these men with their big ships and loud engines would not overlook a possible benefit. They were not so abundant that they could ignore anything that might serve them. Food, propaganda, proof, leverage. The thought gave him a small, bitter satisfaction. But Anderson did not act like a man collecting rations. On the destroyer's deck in a dry spot, the box was set down. Anderson walked to it and crouched. He did not touch the wet sprouts with his bare hands. Instead, he used a flashlight to inspect the interior, the wiring run by hand, the improvised connections, the small pump, the cloth medium, the way the light had been mounted. He told a technical sergeant to photograph it from multiple angles. Another man began to write notes. The process was quiet and thorough, the way an engineer studies a device that might matter later. To Karl, that seriousness was more unsettling than looting. If they were merely hungry, they would have laughed and eaten. This looked like evidence collection, like engineering interest, like a different kind of taking. Before long, the escort carrier loomed near, its dark mass splitting the lead-gray sea. Under destroyer escort U-6012 was nudged along like a small captive animal toward the carrier's side. Standing on the U-boat's deck, Karl looked up at the carrier's flight deck, its dense anti-aircraft mounts, its sheer vertical bulk. The scale difference was not just tonnage. It was industrial capacity made visible. It was one war machine meeting another, and the smaller one being absorbed. On the U-boat, they had lived by hiding, by vanishing into depth, by convincing themselves they were hunters. Here, under full daylight and searchlights and the open sky, Karl felt the truth of their vulnerability. A surface submarine was a fragile thing. Against this floating factory of steel and fuel and aircraft, it was almost laughable. The transfer was procedural. German crewmen were marched in groups across a swaying gangway, hands controlled, voices kept low. There were no blows, no taunts, only quick instructions and the cold contact of metal. Karl, as an officer and technical lead, was separated and taken to a temporary holding area on a lower deck near the hangar. It had once been storage. Now thick bars had been welded into place, forming small cells. Inside his space was a canvas cot bolted to the deck and a tin bucket for washing up and sanitation. That ordinary treatment felt wrong to Karl. He had expected hatred. He had expected cruelty. At least cruelty would have matched the story he carried in his head. Instead, he found procedure. The first interrogation came the second day aboard the carrier. In a small compartment near the officers' spaces, there was a table, chairs, charts on the bulkhead, and a box of internal communications equipment. Major Anderson sat in control of the conversation, calm, precise. Beside him was a younger man, Technical Sergeant Davis, who handled notes and occasionally added specific questions. Anderson's focus was technical, engine model, submerged endurance calculations, sonar set type and recent faults, battery failure symptoms and probable causes. Davis wrote steadily, his pen consistent. When he spoke, his English was flat and practical, with a hint of Midwestern cadence. And he sounded like a man asking for data because the data mattered, not because he wanted to humiliate a prisoner. Karl answered with caution. He kept his responses short and exact, limited to facts he could not plausibly deny. All the while he waited for the question about the box. That was the point he had prepared to defend, the point where he expected pressure. Instead, when Anderson asked about life aboard and crew health, he mentioned it only as an aside. He'd heard they had tried growing vegetables inside the boat. Karl's chest tightened. He admitted, vaguely, that there had been a small experiment, a personal curiosity about plant growth in extreme conditions, and that it had been discarded before surrender. Anderson nodded, expression unchanged. He did not pry. Davis wrote a line, homemade hydroponic device, observed, confirmed discarded prior to surrender. Then Anderson returned to diesel consumption figures. Walking back to his cell, Karl felt confused, almost insulted. The box was important to him. It was a symbol of resourcefulness, of endurance, of refusal to let the boat become a coffin. He had imagined it would matter to them. Yet to Anderson it was a footnote. In the days that followed, Karl's confusion deepened. Through bars and along escort routes, he saw fragments of carrier life. The smells from the mess were richer than he expected, something more than canned meat and hard bread. He saw stew on trays that, whatever its color, contained vegetables. He spotted dehydrated fruit. Once he saw a sailor walking by with a fresh apple, wrinkled but real. A corridor bulletin listed menu items: potatoes, cabbage, carrots. Even if most were stored and bland, the variety was real. One day, when Davis escorted him to an office near the hangar to confirm a piping diagram, Karl waited while papers were fetched. On a nearby desk lay worn technical manuals and American popular magazines. The covers showed smiling women and advertisements for a flood of goods. In a corner, absurdly, a tin can held a living green plant, a succulent Karl could not name. It sat there as if war were something that happened elsewhere. These details pressed against the propaganda pictures in Karl's mind. Allied sailors as crude men, living off loot and ration misery, their culture empty, their supplies scarce. What he saw did not match. He did not change his loyalty, but a hard edge in him dulled. His readiness to fight to the last secret began to feel less natural when the enemy seemed, at least at first, not to need what he had. Later interrogations became more frequent and were often handled mainly by Davis. The questions stayed technical. He asked about freshwater production efficiency, exhaust handling limitations while submerged, and the hydroponic device, now with an academic flavor that startled Karl. "Mr. Schmidt," Davis said once, tapping his notebook, "your light source was a modified low-voltage bulb. How did you estimate wavelength and intensity? Did you consider spectrum effects on sprout fiber content?" It was not the voice of a man extracting military secrets. It was the voice of an engineer talking to another engineer. Karl stayed guarded, but he could not help answering more than he intended, mentioning improvised filters and a change he had noticed in stem stiffness. When Davis asked about nutrient balance, how Karl kept nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium roughly steady without standardized reagents, Karl hesitated. Pride pulled him toward a real answer. Caution held him back. He said it had been done by feel with no precise recipe, and that he no longer remembered exact ratios. Davis looked at him as if he understood what was being withheld. He did not threaten. He only wrote and moved on. That calm made Karl oddly irritated. He had prepared for a fight and found none. He felt briefly ridiculous. The planned run toward Reykjavik, Iceland, was extended by circumstances. First came a North Atlantic storm that forced the formation to alter course and slow. Then the carrier's listening section intercepted and partially decrypted a piece of German U-boat communications involving a new Wolfpack coordination cipher. It was treated as high priority. The task force commander chose to remain in a relatively safe area longer so experts ashore could analyze the fragment through encrypted channels, and so the escort could maintain a stable, protective pattern while the work was done. For Karl, it meant confinement without an end date. At first, the carrier's supply margin still showed in small ways: meals with occasional bits of vegetable, oatmeal with raisins, stews that carried more than one taste. But changes arrived gradually and unmistakably. The soft boiled carrot or parsnip that sometimes appeared at dinner vanished. The dehydrated vegetable fragments in stew became fewer, then almost decorative. Breakfast oatmeal lost its raisins and any hint of dried fruit. In the corridor, Karl saw tray after tray pass by, perhaps the starch portion a little larger, the protein portion steady, the color gone. He began to notice physical signs. A young sailor passed him and unconsciously licked at a corner of his mouth where skin had peeled and turned red. In a corridor bend, two sailors spoke low. One complained that his gums bled easily when he brushed his teeth. These were small things, the kind men dismiss until they add up. The interrogation shifted in the same direction. Davis asked about hydroponics every time now, and the questions grew more urgent, more specific. The room remained polite, procedural, but a different pressure gathered in the air. Shadows under Davis's eyes darkened. Sometimes he spoke faster than before, and when he wrote, his pen seemed to bite the paper. "Mr. Schmidt," he said one day, pointing at a sketched circuit, "you mentioned using the boat's 24-volt DC and dropping voltage with series resistors for the bulb. How did you keep output stable under variable load? Did you ever scorch a whole batch when the voltage swung?" He looked up, waiting. There was no overt threat in him. There was focus, the focus of a man trying to solve a problem that mattered. Karl leaned back and noticed a small stain on Davis's collar. It was a trivial detail, but it signaled strain. He also heard the tiredness in Davis's voice, the slightly shortened breath at the end of sentences. The propaganda voice in Karl's head grew loud. The enemy was greedy and hypocritical. Once they suffered shortage, they would use any method to extract what they needed. Here it was, unfolding. They lacked fresh food. Now they wanted his technique, a dark satisfaction mixed with resistance. His war was reduced to this: information as leverage. "Stability was experience," Karl said flatly. "No instruments. Scorching happens. Luck." He omitted the crude smoothing capacitor he had built from scrap parts, a rough stabilizer that had saved seedlings more than once. Davis wrote, then asked about the nutrient solution, freshwater limitations, condensate use, seawater dilution, root development under different salinities. Karl gave him the hinge lie. Condensate worked poorly. Seawater, even small amounts, suppresses germination and causes root rot. In truth, his notes showed that properly settled and diluted seawater at a specific ratio could supply trace elements and improve early growth. He gave Davis the opposite. Davis paused with his pen midline. He looked at Karl for a long moment as if weighing the answer against what he already suspected. Then he moved on. Without standardized fertilizer, what substitutes? Organic sources? Karl shrugged stiffly. No good substitute. The beans carry their own stores. After sprouting, growth stalls. Another lie: they had fermented small food scraps, breadcrumbs, tea leaves into a foul-smelling supplement that extended the crop's life. Karl kept that to himself. That day there was a Marine at the door, posted as guard. He had no interest in circuits or nutrients. He shifted, bored and irritated, eyes alternating between Karl and the clock. When Karl gave another vague answer, the Marine muttered loud enough to be heard, Christ, like hell this German's going to tell the truth. Davis snapped a sharp look at him. The Marine shut up, but his resentment remained on his face. The outburst hardened Karl. There it was, the honest contempt he expected. Davis's professionalism could be a mask or an eccentricity, but the guard's mutter felt like the true tone beneath. Karl's earlier confusion, his quiet softening from ordinary observations, congealed again into an enemy line. Let them feel their own weakness. Let them bleed gums and lose endurance. That, too, was war. At the end of that interrogation, Davis closed his notebook but did not immediately call for Karl to be removed. He sat silent for a moment, staring at the diagrams and formulas on the table. The room's only sound was the faint hum of ventilation. "Mr. Schmidt," Davis said finally, quieter than before, with something mixed into his technical cadence, "I know you may not believe me, or you may not care. But if we can verify this, it can help people. Not just on this ship, not just soldiers." He paused, choosing words. "When you go without fresh food for too long, you get weak, you get sick, your judgment drops. You know that." Karl met his eyes without expression. He remembered a torpedo man on U6012 whose gums had swelled at the first edge of scurvy, his mood turning dark, his hands trembling with fatigue. Karl had built the vegetable box because he did not want to watch men decay in that slow, stupid way. But that had been on his boat for his crew. Now he turned his head, stared at chipped paint on the bulkhead, and said nothing. The shortage signs seeped outward until even a prisoner could not miss them. The carrier's daily rhythm, once precise, picked up small off-notes. Sailors in corridors looked paler. Their steps carried less stored energy. Some deck drills were shortened or replaced by talk. The banging of repairs in the hangar came in longer gaps. It was not seasickness. It was a slow nutritional drain, the body paying interest on a debt of missing vitamins. Karl watched a young technician climb a steep ladder and pause halfway, breath catching, fingers whitening on the rail. It was a normal ladder. It should not have been hard. Karl's own prisoner meal arrived each day on schedule. It had simplified. Hard bread, a fixed portion of beans or canned meat paste, a pat of butter or margarine, and always, inexplicably, a small pinch of cooked vegetables. Sometimes a few dull cabbage leaves, sometimes overcooked carrot shreds, once a few peas. The portion was tiny, nutritionally almost symbolic, but against the ship-wide drift into brown food, that small color seemed loud. At first Karl assumed it was theater, humanitarian display, proof of conduct for paperwork and conscience. He ate it with cold contempt. So this was how they polished themselves. But that assumption began to loosen. The Marine who often delivered the tray was the same man who had muttered in the interrogation room. He made no effort to hide his dislike. He shoved the tray through the bars with a clatter. Once, as he pushed it in, he muttered something Karl caught. "Sergeant Davis's share." The rest was swallowed by his breath, but the irritation was clear. The phrase landed in Karl like a pebble thrown into still water. The turning point came in an accidental corridor meeting. One afternoon, Karl was escorted to identify specialized tools removed from the U-boat. Afterward, on the way back to the holding area, they passed through a quieter passageway. Davis approached from the other end, papers in hand, walking fast as if chasing an idea. In the narrow corridor, he looked up at the last moment, recognized Karl and the guard, and shifted to let them pass. In that brief moment, Karl saw Davis in neutral ship light rather than interrogation glare. Davis's cheeks were thinner. His skin looked unhealthy, pale under the lamps. Shadows under his eyes had deepened, but what caught Karl was Davis's mouth, a small crack at one corner, scabbed over, and a faint patch of peeling pale skin along the lower lip, an ordinary symptom, unmistakable to someone who had lived with vitamin deficiency in a sealed hull. Davis seemed to realize Karl had noticed, his lips pressed together in a quick reflexive motion like a man hiding a weakness. He nodded once and walked on, keeping his pace. That small gesture pierced a cluster of assumptions, the propaganda caricatures, the easy contempt, Karl's own expectation of greedy extraction. None of it fit cleanly beside this concrete fact. The American technician himself was suffering from the shortage. That night the tray arrived as usual. The same Marine delivered it. The side dish was a few slices of onion, cooked almost transparent, and 2 short carrot sticks, their orange still fairly bright. As he shoved the tray in, Karl's eyes went not to the food, but to the Marine's hands. In his other fist, the Marine held his own meal wrapped in greaseproof paper. The edge showed gray-yellow bean mash and bread, no color. As the Marine turned away, he muttered again, this time clearly enough for each word to land, "God damn it, Davis insists on giving up his own damn carrots, too, to that fucking fascist." He stomped off, still cursing. Karl stood still and stared at the 2 carrot sticks. They lay beside the brown beans, their color vivid enough to look almost obscene in the monotone. A rush of emotion hit him like cold seawater forced into the lungs. He saw Davis's cracked lip again. He saw the Marine's drab ration. And he understood. This was not theater. It was not abundance. It was one person's deliberate choice. Sergeant Davis giving up his own scarce vegetables so the prisoner received them. A line had echoed in Karl's mind before, bitter and protective. What he treated as proof of dignity and struggle was being converted by the enemy into cold subsystem performance data. That thought had tasted like violation. Now, in front of 2 carrot sticks, it gained another weight. Yes, Anderson's framework reduced his box to parameters and coefficients. But the human being carrying out that analysis, the man with the cracked lip, was also making a different kind of calculation, a choice shaped by professional ethic and by the basic refusal to let people rot when there was a possible fix. The wall built by propaganda did not collapse with a roar. It cracked with a clean, unmistakable sound inside Karl, the sound of certainty breaking. He did not feel simple gratitude. He felt shock and a kind of vertigo, as if the floor of his worldview had shifted. He had defined himself by practical pride, resisting an enemy he imagined as greedy and false. Now, one particular enemy had shown him a purer practicality, one that accepted personal loss to prevent avoidable pain. Davis wanted Karl's technique, partly for analysis, partly to solve a shipwide problem, but also perhaps because he could not tolerate watching men weaken when there was a possible remedy. That complexity did not fit Karl's simple, two-sided model. Karl stared at the carrots for a long time before moving. Shame, upheaval, and something he could not name pressed on his chest. His deliberate lies, his cold watching, his stubborn refusal now looked narrow, even contemptible. He lifted his spoon, ate the carrots. They were soft and bland, yet he knew he would remember the taste for the rest of his life. Late that night, after lights dimmed in the holding area, Karl lay on the hard canvas cot, staring at the ceiling, pipes crisscrossing like veins. The carrots were long digested, but the weight remained. Davis's pale face, the cracked lip, the Marine's muttered complaint replayed over and over. The propaganda wall had failed under the weight of one verifiable act. Karl realized he had been fighting a demonized phantom. The truth was, individuals making choices inside strain. Davis's choice pointed to a logic of responsibility that did not stop at uniform boundaries. It paid in health. That realization drowned Karl's remaining hesitation. The next morning, Karl asked to see Sergeant Davis. When he was brought into the small compartment, he did not circle the point. He admitted that his earlier technical answers contained omissions and deliberate misdirection. Then he corrected them methodically and in detail. He described the smoothing capacitor he had improvised and how it stabilized current under load. He gave the precise safe dilution ratio for seawater after settling and filtering, and he explained why timing and temperature mattered. He described the fermented organic supplement, breadcrumbs and tea leaves, sour and unpleasant but effective, and the way he controlled mold risk with careful rinsing and ventilation. Davis listened and wrote with concentration. He did not demand motive. He asked only for clarifications where the details mattered, measurements, time, the order of steps. When Karl finished, he felt emptied out and strangely relieved. He had not only handed over technique, he had paid a debt to his own conscience. Davis acted quickly. Using Karl's description, a small test hydroponic setup was built in a corner of the hangar area: wood, tubing, a light, a pump, a loop. Karl guided it indirectly through Davis, speaking when asked, correcting angles and distances, suggesting what to salvage and what to avoid. In the last 2 days of the voyage, pale sprouts pushed up through the medium. That tiny green in the stale ship air was a quiet proof. When they reached Iceland, the transfer paperwork included a technical evaluation note. Karl Schmidt possessed cooperative value in a specific field. On the later crossing to the United States and through the months that followed, Karl's life filled with procedural questioning and assessment. He no longer resisted. He answered what he was asked, and sometimes he volunteered extensions, variations, contingencies, ways to improvise under constraint. In the end, he was placed at a research facility with Navy ties as a detained expert consultant, assigned to organize and analyze German emergency survival technologies. He saw more documents, more data, and more evaluation reports than he had ever imagined existing, each one stripping lived experience into bullet points and diagrams. One late autumn afternoon, in an archives room, Karl paged through an old report on polar survival while stray snow drifted past the window. He remembered with perfect clarity that gray morning on the North Atlantic, the pale splash as the wooden box hit the water. At the time, he had believed he was throwing away supplies that might help the enemy, preserving the last shred of practical dignity left to a defeated man. He had not imagined the box would be fished out. He had not imagined that what would pry him open was not threat or hunger, but a stranger's decision to give up his own carrots. He closed the report. Technique could be stripped of feeling and turned into data used for assessment, improvement, even future confrontation. Anderson and the reports proved that, but the creation of technique, its transfer, and the moment it became shared could never be fully cleansed of what happened inside it. Human choices made under extreme conditions. Davis's choice showed Karl that beneath cold procedure and the iron logic of war, a small human light could still exist and still matter. Basic respect for a technical peer, even an enemy, and a minimum responsibility to life. This was not simple conversion, and it was not simple surrender. It was a technician's painful recalibration after a double trap of material hardship and ideological conditioning. after seeing that within the enemy system, individual behavior could diverge sharply from system logic. War could turn people into parts, but in certain seams and cracks, it could also force out a thin cross-faction understanding and a limited cooperation based on shared circumstance. Karl's technique, built in a sealed submarine for his own crew, had crossed a boundary not because it was conquered, but because it was offered back by someone who refused to let suffering remain unnecessary. Outside, the snow thickened, whitening the distant training field and the lines of barbed wire. Karl stood, filed the report away, and knew he would carry this conclusion for the rest of his life. In the cold ocean of data, a concrete act of kindness is the faint star that can still steer you.